Okay, so we are going to get started. Once again, there is a link to the Pear Deck, which we're using for the interactive component for today's webinar. You can either go to what it says on the screen in a new window on your computer, joinpd.com and enter the code, or go to the chat hangout or the Hangouts chat. And so we are going to jump right in. When it comes to looking at Google Forms, this is a topic that people sometimes either know a lot about or they don't know much about, or if they have used them, we wanted to go over some key features that are super helpful for distance learning and maximizing those elements of student accountability. So we're going to jump right in. Today's goals. One, I can identify technical features of Google Forms and know how to create a Google form. Okay, and those will involve advanced features as well as basic features. We're going to look at help you to be able to use Google Forms to implement high-impact formative assessment strategies. We will be covering those in our instructional component of today's webinar, as well as show you how to access some pre-made forms that we've developed for you that you are welcome to make a copy of. We've done a variety of ones for check for understanding, guided reading strategies, as well as goal setting. So we are excited, and I know that Jenny and I will continue to contribute to add to those folders as we continue to go over a variety of resources and make more forms. At the end of this session, and after you review the handout and think about the things from the webinar today, please fill out the reflection form. We are submitting these, which will make you eligible for professional learning hours in my learning plan. So make sure that you do that. In the past, we've had people be kind of delayed with that, but we'll have to get a little stricter on deadlines so that we can actually get these pieces into my learning plan. So Jenny will follow up more on that via email. So we're going to jump right in with the interactive component. I want you to think about, and then on your Pear Deck, you can actually respond, which one of these things doesn't belong? And I have about, let's see, 4 people already responded. We'll let more people, oh, good. Huh? Someone changed their mind. Okay, so I'm going to just show the responses real quick. We have most people saying a bottle of ketchup, and then the other group saying the hammer. I'm going to hide responses now. So the interesting thing about this is actually an activity or an example given in the book Embedded Formative Assessment by Dylan William, Dr. Dylan William, and his work is what we're going to be sharing pieces of today. And the key thing here, both of you are right. Those of you who chose the hammer and the ketchup, because I did not give you the context of what our goal was. So for example, all things you would find in a kitchen would be a knife, a fork, and a bottle of ketchup, but also metal tools would be a knife, a fork, and a hammer. So depending on what our goal was, those answers would have had different priorities. And a lot of times, this is what also happens in the assignments that we provide to our students. I have a 2nd grader at home. Her name's Mariana, and she actually had an activity that was sent home for distance learning, and it only came with the information that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, and she actually got a lot of them wrong because she wasn't clear about the focus on measuring and how you always have to start from 0 when you're measuring. And it was really interesting how even a bright, sharp girl like Mariana, who does really well in school, missing some of those direction pieces were not helpful for using this assignment for learning, which is obviously the goal. And then also helping kids to realize, that there is a criteria, there is something that they need to learn in specificity is part of our job as teachers. And that's also important. I'll share this funny little anecdote because she is a a pretty smart kid. And I disagree with this response, but when I tried to get her to look back at it and explain what I think the learning target was, she said, well, it doesn't matter because it's what I thought. And so once again, that's also why it's important to have clear learning targets to support not only students, but caregivers at home. So if I also said, here's a boat, let's go somewhere, how many of you would just say yes and jump on in? We'll see what our responses say. Oh. Wow, I have a lot of trusting friends out there. It's probably because you know me. And actually, this is probably what would happen in our classroom. I'm going to show the responses. We have most people saying, no, I'm not going to join you. You're probably hoping I had a third question that said, maybe, depending on the questions that I have about where we're going, how we're getting there, and what we're going to do. And that is also very true when it comes to learning. So that being said, let me get the notes out of the way here. When it comes to teaching and learning, the assessment component is really what bridges the gap between teaching and learning. A lot of times, you know, we put the learning out there, we engage kids in a task, but then it's that assessment piece that we need in order to truly connect those two pieces. And I know in our first webinar, we did designing assessment strategies, but now we're talking about really how do we hone in. That being said, Google Forms is today's focus. We're going to talk about how very specific ways that Google Forms can not only help teachers, but help students articulate the gaps in their learning. And how do we really get students and train students as expert learners to think about where am I going in my learning, where am I now, and how would I close a potential gap? And the first step that we see in the research, and this may seem quite obvious to those of us working in New Berlin, because we do have a very strong focus on assessment for learning practices and achievement-based grading. But setting clear learning intentions for all that you do is the main piece that we're going to look at instructionally today. That being said, there's key questions that learning intentions focus on. One, we are learning to. So what is our purpose? What am I looking for? So, you know, what does good look like? Success criteria. And then this is because. So as we develop learning experiences, and specifically as we go through creation of Google Forms today, we want to do them through these lenses. Not only as teachers do we want to be able to see what kids are learning, know what we're looking for in terms of success, but also being able to communicate relevance. And we're going to talk about very specific examples about how to do this, as well as provide some resources. Also, the book Embedded Formative Assessment by Dylan William, one of my favorites. I've loved this book for a long time. Really, you know, he also says that there's acronyms. Your good friends are going to be Walt, Whiff, and Tib. Okay, so as we're defining these. The next activity that we're going to do here is where I want you to decide if the learning intention written below is confusing or you think it's pretty well clarified. Okay, so we're going to go through several of these and see where we are. So as you're looking at this, you can say, is it confusing or clarified? So confusing or clarified. So confusing is A, clarified is B. Okay. Hide responses. We're going to go to our next one. Is this one confusing or clarified? To be able to present an argument for or against suicide. And I think it should actually say assisted suicide. Okay. We're about half and half here as well, so I'll show the responses. Pretty equal. Okay. I'm going to go to the next one. Is this one confusing or clarified? To know what the local priest does. Show some responses. Okay, and then I believe our last one here. To produce and analyze a questionnaire about movie-going habits. Okay. And then, oh. Then we have our last one, truly last one. To design an experiment to find out what conditions pill bugs prefer. Okay, once again we're pretty even, pretty divided. So, well, there actually are correct answers to this. And it has to do with, is this confusing or clarified learning objective? They actually are all listed as confusing. And we are going to talk about why. So this is what I was talking about. When it comes to those confused learning objectives, the first one says to be able to write instructions on how to change a bicycle tire. The reason that's confusing is because it blurs the line of the learning objective and the context. That being said, the true learning objective is writing clear instructions. That's what the student needs to be able to know and do. The context is the bicycle tire. Same thing if we go down to the second from the bottom, it says students should be able to produce and analyze a questionnaire about movie-going habits. That is confused because the true goal is about constructing and analyzing questionnaire data. The context of where it's applied is movie-going habits. And why do we care? This is where we look at transference. So when we look at the work of Doug Fisher, Nancy Fry, they talk about types of learning. And the real big goal is to get to transfer. So that's where kids not only understand skills and content, but they can apply that knowledge to a brand new situation. And as we're setting up Google Forms, we're going to talk about how to develop a Google Form and use and maximize features of them to do just that. And why do learning intentions matter? As we know, developing expert learners really provide us with the ability for students to guide and identify not only what they need to know and do, but gaps in their learning as well. So as we get into the things today, we want you to think about how you're creating Google Forms in terms of these questions. And how do you get kids to think about, we are learning too, so what's your purpose? I am looking for, so indicators of success, and this is because, so what's the relevance? So Jane, you want to take it away and talk through the features?
Yeah, so we're going to go over kind of a brief overview of some of the basic features and then dive a little bit into some of those other technical features as well. So if we go to the next slide, really when we're thinking about who can create these Google Forms, it really is everyone, not only classroom teachers, but of course your students as well, and for a variety of purposes, whether it be you know, exit tickets, surveys like we typically might have done on paper and pencil back in you know, years ago. But in addition to that, we can use it for conferring or goal setting or data collection. And we'll show you some examples later on for how teachers are currently using these as well. If we go to the next slide, and someone was saying that they're not seeing them, getting started. As far as just those basic overview features, one of the first things to think about is, are you adding collaborators? Please note that when you add a collaborator, they have editing rights. So what you'll want to encourage someone to do is, if you're sharing a Google form with them, just to see what you've done, you'll want to encourage them, if you don't want them changing anything on your end and not editing it out, to add, you know, to make a copy of it and then do that themselves. This is also, when you click on these three dots next to the send button in your picture, is the spot that you would be able to make that copy of the Google form. You also would be able to access add-ons, which we're not going to cover specifically in this webinar, but if you're interested in what are add-ons that are available, we can talk with you about that. And then in addition to this, this is where you'd get that pre-filled link or send your survey or whatever the form is being used for to its recipients. Next. This is along the top. This is your icon bar. The nice thing about this is, and we'll talk about some of these icons, but it becomes an easy way for students to know where to go to find things such as previewing what their Google form looks like, settings, and in addition to that, what students enjoy the most if they're making their own personal one is customizing those themes. On the next slide, one thing that we will, if you want to go ahead to the next slide, with looking at the settings. Right, when looking at the settings themselves, first of all, the first option you have in the tabs, you'll see you can do general, presentation, and questions. And with general, one thing to notice when you're doing that is you can decide if you want to collect email responses and things like that. You also can edit after the submission for some respondents and things like that. In the presentation portion, you can decide if you want to shuffle question order and show progress as someone is taking a Google form that you've provided to them. And then the final one, the quiz tab, would actually turn the form into a quiz where you can decide if there's point values, if respondents can see questions that they've missed and answered incorrectly, and when the grade will be released. And you can either control that to be initially or things like that. And again, that's just by turning on the light switch at the top that makes it a quiz. On the next slide, we mentioned customizing themes. If you are having students design their own, this is usually the part that they enjoy the most. We've had a lot of students create Google Forms when they're making maybe a Google site, and this is a way for them to get feedback from people who are using their Google site. You can upload images, and there's many that are selected right within the Google tool itself, or you can upload your own photos or search the web. And of course, you can also change those themes and background colors. Next up is options with questions. So you can choose different types of questions. Obviously, the more basic ones are multiple choice, but you can, and we'll talk about this in another slide, but you can make them a little more advanced by doing multiple choice grid or checkbox. You also can add paragraph and short answer are ones that we'll also refer to a lot. And you can choose whether or not the question is required or not. If it's required, students will not be able to see the next slide if they do not answer that specific slide. Now, looking at a little bit more advanced features, we also have branching. And so when describing this to students, a lot of times we'll talk to them about how if you think about a tree, you know, you have that base, think of the base as your Google form at the start, and then those branches are the different places you could go. And kids like it if you talk about like a squirrel running up different parts of the tree, that might work. But based on which way they go, then it's like what will happen next. And so advanced branching allows you to have students to get different options based on prior answers. This has been really popular in the past for choose your own adventure, and also completing online lessons and activities as well. And so you can see that once you are creating a question, you can decide if they need to go to a certain section based on that particular response. And again, as Caroline said, we will be happy to meet with any of you if you want to learn more about that specific feature. Quiz mode is, again, allowing you to create a quiz out of a Google form. And so we've talked a little bit about this. If we go to the next slide, we're going to skip, I don't know if you can keep going.
I will. I'm just giving people the slides in the chat, like a link where they can just follow along and view. I'm sorry.
And so when you're thinking about assessment, we were going to use this for Pear Deck, but you can just think in your head if you've ever used Google Forms for a student assessment in the past. On the next slide, one of the things, if you're thinking about making that's important, is you can create those and make those, again, immediately, or you can change the settings to be later on. In the following slide, one thing that is nice with quizzes is you can automatically see quiz responses. A lot of times it's nice for you as a teacher to quickly assess where students are at, because you can see what are those frequently missed questions. You also get access to nice graphs that will show, who had the correct answers, average, median, and range scores as well. So again, those are some nice features within the quiz mode itself. On the next slide, we'll also talk a little bit about how would you grade individual responses. And this is actually a link within the handout that we've already mentioned a few times. But essentially, if you collect the email addresses of each participant who takes the quiz and assign points or leave feedback on those responses, after you grade each response, you can save those changes. And so that allows you to grade individual responses for students. And the directions are on this slide as well, but we link those directions within the handout. On the next slide, one thing you'll notice too is you can select the correct answer when you're deciding, what is the point value and things like that. So here is a very basic question: who was president during World War II? Assigned it 5 points and selected the correct answer. You also could add answer feedback that the person taking the quiz would be able to see afterwards if you enable that. On the next slide, you also have some choices of if you want students to be able to immediately see their grade, or if you would like the grade to be released later on. By default, grades will be released immediately and email addresses will not be collected. So you might want to consider that and think about that as you go on. If you collect those email addresses, again, then you can also have a little bit more of an ability to wait for when you send those back to students to let them see their grade. On the following slide, again, you can also, if you would like to, you can get email notifications for new responses. That's a nice feature so that you're not always, especially with distance learning, trying to see who is answering it at what time. You can also send emails and release those scores at any time, as we've already mentioned. And again, check the boxes next to the students. Right now, I didn't have any students when I was doing this, but you can just check the name next to those students to release those responses. On the next slide, if we're thinking about ways, and again, it's not going to be perfect, but ways to prevent students from potentially sharing answers with one another when we're doing distance learning, or even in a regular learning environment, like next year or whenever it might be, one of the options you can think about is shuffling the order of your answers. So for this one, for example, you click on the 3 dots near where it says, you can actually shuffle the option order. It doesn't change the options. You're still going to have those 4 presidents listed, but it can change the order, which can make it a little bit more random and difficult for students to share with each other what the answer might be. On the next slide, another option when you're thinking about how could you make it a little bit more difficult for students to potentially share those answers is consider adding sections. There's this little button on the side, and this is the icon you see when you want to just add any question to your form, whether it's a quiz or not a quiz, and that is the sections. Sections allow you to break your quiz into different parts so that they have to do different parts at different at different points of the thing. The quiz. It is a common problem from some of the research I've done that if you post your quiz through Google Classroom to all of your sections early in the day, then all students will be able to like see the whole entire quiz. So this way, if it's broken into sections, the first section could just be name and email address or something like that. And then you put the content that you really want to be tested in the next section, meaning that once a student starts taking that quiz, that's the only point they would see those new questions. So again, that's just a way to make it a little bit more secure. Another thing that we've already mentioned a little bit about is those branching options. You also could, when you're creating your Google quiz, is create a branched form where you add ungraded multiple choice questions in your quiz. Now this one's a little bit more confusing, but essentially, and I tried to take a screenshot of it, the multiple choice question usually is something that's random. It could be something related to your class, but that there's really necessarily no right or wrong answer. And then you have different sections where based on how they respond, they go to a different section. And what a lot of teachers are doing from what I've seen is they'll actually have the same questions go each way, but then have the order of the question answers like mixed up a little bit. So essentially, if I responded red, I would go one way, see one question. If I went to green, I might see a different question first, and then the questions would rotate. Again, it's just a little bit of a way to slightly change your quiz to make it a little bit more difficult for students to share. Another slide that we have here is, in addition to that, is you want to think about the variety of types of questions that you could ask within your Google form. One idea is you could add reading passages or free response short answers. Those, of course, cannot be graded manually by the computer, and that you would have to go in and grade. As you'll notice, I have it circled on the slide. The add title and description is where you could actually add, like here I added General MacArthur's radio address. I titled it and I added the quote that I wanted my students to see. And then I made a question where I asked what the main message is. And then students had to give that long answer response. Next slide. I don't know if it's going.
Could you change it?
Oh, okay.
I did.
Sorry. On the next slide, which I'm not sure if we can see yet, you also want to think about the different types of questions that you could ask as far as sequence questions or even matching questions. There it goes. So with sequence questions, you could use the checkbox grid question type to ask students a sequence or ask them to arrange items in a list. Also, you could orders of operations and things like that. They could be asked for that type of question. With matching questions, you would be able to use multiple choice with a grid type, which I've seen a lot that students are using, or teachers are using that for the vocabulary quizzes. But again, it's just a great way for it to make it more involved, where it's more difficult for students to share those answers. On the next slide, when we're also thinking about other varieties of types, is you could ask students either a video or an image question. So here is another example of that, where I actually created options. And this is also really good for our younger learners, where if you are giving an option, or again, if we're thinking UDL, option one, instead of it saying option one, you could have the words there, but then the picture that supports the words. So again, helping students if they might have some issues potentially reading what the options are. Also, if you use images as opposed to words and then sort those out, that could be a way, again, to make it a little bit more difficult for students to potentially try to find answers in some way. Also, having students watch a video and then having them do a reflection on that or a response is a great way to check where they are in their understanding without necessarily grading them in something that the computer would manually do. On the next slide, we also do have one option called enabling the locked quiz mode. Now, Google Forms locked quiz modes is a very good feature that we have for students that would be in our using our district issued Chromebooks. So for most of us, that would be our secondary students, unless you happen to have third or second graders that got a Chromebook during distance learning. If students are using Chrome on another device, so that would be a Windows or a Mac computer, it will not work. And so what you'll see is in the quiz section underneath where you've made it a quiz, there's a little box that you can check that turns on the lock mode. So again, that would be good for our secondary students, which again locks them in and prevents them from, while they're taking the quiz, going out and looking at other tabs and things like that.
Jenny, can I ask a question quick about that?
Sure.
I have a student that has an issued MacBook from the school because she has some vision problems. So I can't do the locked mode because she has a Mac, and then that takes off the locked mode for the entire class. Is there any way that we can do it as long as they're like using the SDNB email account, or does it have to be on a Chromebook?
That's a Chromebook feature,
Okay.
but I can mention that to Brandon and ask. One other option you could do is, I know it would be inconvenient, but you could duplicate the quiz and give her the same quiz, but a different one than what the other students are getting, so that you wouldn't have that.
It's not, I mean, it's not a class that I'm super worried about cheating. It just, I found out the hard way when I made it on locked mode, and she emailed me panicked that she couldn't get in. So
Okay.
that's good to
Yeah,
know.
we'll ask Brandon. All right, Caroline.
Okay.
Oh, this is me still, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it is still you. I was like, I think it's still you.
All right, so now if we're thinking about, well, what does this look like in the classroom? How are students maybe using Google Forms themselves? If we look at the next slide, one way that students can actually really show their thinking is by analyzing data that they've collected through some of our screencasting tools. And I know we spoke about this last week, and we mentioned this a little bit on the first webinar as well, but two quick, easy screencasting tools to remember that students have access to is definitely Screencastify on Google Chrome, so definitely your Chromebooks having that access. And then on the iPad, as long as you enable it within your control settings where you can do a screen recording, our students can record their iPad. And so if I am ready to record, I would open up a Google form. And if we go to the next slide, I would be able to annotate on that slide and discuss what I'm seeing and things like that. This is actually a picture and the assignment from a social studies class. This is actually Diana Hersig's class, where they had done some gathering of data and giving survey questions to other students. And then they actually got their poll results, and they used Screencastify, and they had this assignment where they had to talk about the conclusions that they made and how they might make improvements in the future to their survey. And they really loved the interactivity of how they were able to see these graphs and the visual of the results that they had received. And that's one of the big wins with students, is being able to see that data and then being able to get that analysis. And I've had students do that across a lot of the different grade levels. This is actually an example from Kelly Schlegel. She uses Google Forms quite a bit with her students. This was actually ways that they were collecting data during group discussions. So you can see they were asking about school days and also about vaping, different hot topics that kids were discussing and doing speeches on and research. And if you go to the next slide, how she used Google Forms then with her students, you'll see in the next slide that they actually had a time where they projected those results, and then the debate teams kind of got up and presented their findings and what they were seeing, and then others in the class took notes and then were able to interact and engage with the learners. Another option for using Google Forms is to use it in reflection for how how you are doing within a class itself. So here is again oral interpretation reflection, again just identifying where you're at with your learning. And the next slide, it was interesting too, if it was beneficial for them to practice in small group form. This is again out of Kelly Schlegel's class, and most students agreed with that. If you look at the next slide, I particularly like this one. This is other data that she collected where students gave feedback of whether or not using Seesaw was a good way for them to get feedback outside of school. And you can see 42% agreed. They really like to then see where they were at with this and collect that data. And it's also a way for a teacher too to assess where students are at and what they're thinking about a given topic or activity, or even a tool that they've been using. The next
Okay.
slide,
Yep.
this is actually how we've connected learners across grade levels in schools. So we had a high school class who wanted to know what were some of the questions that sixth graders at Elmwood had about going to Eisenhower and what would it be like there. And so they specifically said, what questions do you have? And so it was helpful for them as they then designed a project that they were making, because they knew their user and what questions they had and how they could help and respond to them. So again, it's a great way to, again, provide survey data and help guide different things that they're doing. All right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we're going to talk about instructional strategies and some more samples and forms that Jenny and I have created. And our goal is to continue to create more. As you know, we're all involved in a million things for you. So that being said, the ones that we're going to show you today and that you are welcome to make a copy of, remember, do not edit it, focus on helping students and teachers really focus on the what are we learning, what am I looking for success, and relevancy. Specifically, we're going to look at how Google Forms can be used for distance learning, checking for understanding, guided reading, as well as goal setting.
All right, so this is an example from sixth grade at Elmwood. This is Jen Calvino, and she actually met with me earlier this year, and she wanted a way to collect some of the data from conferencing with students, both her collecting the data, but then also she experimented with having the students collect and send in their thoughts individually. And so she actually used Google Forms throughout this year for reading and writing. She found what worked best for her was when she was having those conferencing moments with her students, that she individually found that she liked to fill out the form because she said that it allowed the students to really just like explain what their thinking was, and she could just take those notes during the conferring time. She simply would just select their name. She also used it occasionally had students fill these out, but found that it was, she found it more powerful to have it as handed in herself. And you'll see here, and I actually have this in the handout, this is one that I made a copy of with her permission to show you how students were able to even include their celebrations, and she could track over time where students were at. On the next slide, this is another,
Oh,
go ahead.
So remember, we're going to actually cover this in our next session, our next webinar next week. There are ways that you can also, when it comes to supporting parents and caregivers at home, we're even going to look at different ways to provide parents and caregivers with ways to help with monitoring some of this work at the super young grade levels. So just keep in mind that that is something, I know Jenny's talking a lot about things that are done in a face-to-face setting. A lot of those can be carried over in using Google Meet, as well as in our next session, we're going to be exploring how do we really replicate the mentoring piece and the conferencing pieces even at home. So
and I'm glad you mentioned that, because she actually has continued this during distance learning, and I was about to mention that on this slide. Good. Great minds think alike. But essentially, she'll do small groups using Google Meet. Still continues to fill these out. Like she actually said, because she has this whole setup where she uses one computer to fill it out, or she has the Google Meet on her iPad, and then she fills out the information on her computer. So she's continued to do this, which has been exciting. And you can see as well, it's just nice too, because then she has these graphs and she's used them in her own SLO and PPG, as well as she is able to show students where they're at without, giving student names. She did say too that if you are working with students with iPads, that it's really helpful to create a link on the home screen to get easy access to a Google form. So like if I'm a student that is being asked to fill out one of these check-in forms once a week, I would create a quick little access on the home screen, and then I would be able to access it. And her name is Jen Calvino. I saw the question about that. Mm-hmm. And so this if you have any questions about creating a home screen on an iPad, that's essentially a little link that makes it look like an iPad app, but it's really just a link that takes you to whatever it is you're linking. If you go to the next slide, this is from Darcy Bernfeld, who is a teacher at Elmwood as well. She teaches 4th grade. And this is what she used, especially last year, and she has used it more this year as well, is self-assessments for different units within each of the reading units. And so as you can see, students would self-assess. They also would upload specific images of the physical work that they had done during these units. And then she was able to have this data for tracking points as well. On the next slide, this is actually how the 4th grade team at Elmwood has been doing some check-ins during distance learning. And I know Lori Karalik is here today, but this is exciting because what they're able to do is they can do reading check-ins. And I was just looking at a few of those, and you can really see are at process. They use the feature of the long answer, and they have beginning and end. Like this one, for example, is their check-in about setting, and students have to clearly demonstrate where they're at with their learning and what their takeaways were from the particular unit and story that they're reading.
Okay, we're also going to show some examples. We explored a little bit about Project Zero's visible thinking routines last week in our engagement webinar, and we're going to talk about how to incorporate these in a distance learning environment. Last time we talked about how there's a lot of core strategies that you may already be using in a face-to-face setting, but we'd like to also share how they can be applied within Google Forms. And we also in the handout put a link to the site, but Jenny and I are also creating some Google Forms with these strategies so that you can just make copies of them and reproduce them. So once again, because we took them out of the context and we just focused on the learning objective and that visible thinking strategy, it should be easy for teachers to replicate. That being said, we have made open access to these forms that we have created. A lot of the reading comprehension forms I'm getting from a lot of Linda Hoyt in the Revisit, Reflect, Retell book, which is so powerful, as well as looking at secondary resources for close reading, in addition to many other resources from Sue Beers as well. So just so you know, when you go in there, you'll see a variety of ones that we've created. These are the ones from the reading pieces. And I just want to show you a couple examples of ones, and obviously then people can dig through them as they feel appropriate. So in this strategy, the goal was thinking about the author and getting kids to also think about their own selves as readers. The book or the chapter, the author, things about the book or story that they would be proud of if they were the author, thinking about things they would change if they were the author, and then things that they learned about the author's style that they could use in their own writing. And then if they were to talk about this book with a friend, what would they point out? So once again, these are those just very simple strategies that as we get kids to think about these pieces, we can help develop them as readers and writers. And this really goes across grade levels even. Same thing here. It's very simple yet very powerful. It's called the inference equation. And getting kids to get better at thinking about what do they already know and what can they infer, as well as clues from research. And those are just very simple strategies yet very powerful. One thing we'd like to point out is when you're creating Google Forms, try to stick to ones that you can reuse. This is when the beginning where we talked about context of learning versus the actual learning objective. And if you stay more in the line of learning objective, even though, yes, we know context, sometimes you just want to know, do they understand it within the context? But making forms that are easy to reuse. And these visible thinking strategies allow us to do that. Even ones that have to do with like reading a statement. Jenny talked about how using different sections within a Google form would allow you to kind of post that statement and then have kids answer, what does that mean? So close reading of a text, and then supporting opinion with evidence. And those would then all be questions within a form.
Okay, and then this is just the visible thinking forms. As Caroline said, we'll keep adding to these as well. If you look at the next slide, what I did as I was creating these for you is, just explain at the top what the routine is for. But then, for example, I put this image in. You can easily, once you again make a copy of this form, put in the image that you would like students to look at. Or if you wanted to put this on the students, they find an image they put the image into the form, and then they would answer those questions, again, giving them directions of looking at it, listing things. And then one of the things I actually did to kind of add to this is one of the long answers at the end was for them to really think about how could they share it with a partner. Now, even if you're doing a distance learning environment, you could have students meeting virtually or just sharing, responses digitally, and then have them respond, like, what did they notice about what their partner is seeing about the same image. In addition, on the next slide, one thing I liked about the Think, Puzzle, Explore is really just, making those questions all, focusing on them to go and dig deeper as they're getting ready to do some of that inquiry, like what is it that you're focusing on, and prompting them through as they think about their topic. And then again, on the right-hand side, you'll see that one of the things that I tried to do is if I was expecting students to give a little bit more detail, making sure you're very specific, like, for example, share your ideas, please explain when talking about how someone else's explanation is different than yours, what you're noticing. So again, having those students dig deeper, but again, these could easily be copied and shared with your students to do a similar strategy, or you could break it down and only have them do portions of it, or you could also, in a Google Meet meeting together, you could scaffold this and demonstrate its use to students first before you have them use it individually.
And as Jenny pointed out, one of the great things that we also tried to leverage in some of these examples, especially for the literacy ones, is we know young learners often want to sketch, draw their thinking and before they respond in writing. And one of the features that we both mentioned is that students can actually annotate, draw, take their own screenshot or picture and upload that. So even using Google Forms doesn't necessarily mean that kids are tied to just the tech pieces, that there's a lot of other ways that they can engage in showing what they know. So that brings us to what's coming next. Next week, we're going to give very specific examples of secondary and elementary ways to support project-based learning. We chose this topic because at this point in the year, we know a lot of times teachers, we have about 4 weeks left. We want to keep the learning going, but we also want to maybe engage kids in a different format. And project-based learning within the context of distance learning has some similarities in different examples. Then the weeks after that, our tentative goal is to do check-ins, supports, and really help people carry out those pieces. And we're going to look at, like I said, what this looks like at a secondary level as well as an elementary level, and provide some scaffolded ways that you can easily implement this, which I'm excited to share. So that being said, that is next week, Going the Distance Project-Based Learning. Once again, please fill out the reflection form so you are eligible for the professional learning hours. And we look forward to seeing you next time. And thank you for joining us. I'm going to stop recording. And we will take questions once the recording's done.